Thank you guys for joining and coming. My name's Kilgore. I am an evangelist at Powerhouse. This is the open source hub here, and this is a co-organizer also with FOSS Asia. Today I just want to kick things off a little bit with kind of maybe some overall themes that we talk about over the next 4 days here at the Open Source Hub. So the title of this is Open Source and Open Markets. Dracana was asking me earlier, what does it mean to be an open source capitalist, or kind of these big ideas. And it's really, I think, kind of shifting the narrative just from open source being like just this charity, let's protect the environment thing, to really something that is like rapid innovation, gives consumers more choice, and is overall like a better form of economic development just from a pure growth perspective. So, just to go over a brief history, open source, divided in these 4 different eras. We have the kernel era, the 1980s and 90s, the early internet era, web development and cloud era, and then the most recent one that we're in now, the AI and blockchain era there. So the kernel era, this is maybe what I grew up with thinking what open source was like that Linux project that competes with Windows, right? So this was, the purpose was to create a free and open versions of the proprietary software of the core OS. There was a lot of skepticism on open source from the traditional proprietary source community, not thinking they could ever build anything of value. This is part of the inspiration for the Capitalist, because in the 90s I feel like people kept calling open source this socialist thing. It was like a socialism. So this is a really important era for demonstrating that you can actually like develop real complex software in an open source development, because there was a lot of skepticism at that time. The second is the early internet era. I think most marked by Apache and the popularity of that. I think it's still somewhere like 25% of web server traffic is still run on the Apache here. And here becomes another step up in terms of the complexity and be able to perform this. And then it also was a new target group. So there's a lot of people setting up websites, there's all of these different things going on in that early internet era. So there was a lot of open source software that was really, really crucial to the beginnings of the of the internet era. The third one is probably, I think, is actually the most interesting, and so this is like the web development and cloud era. So this would be like 2005 to maybe 2020. And here you see a lot of really big open source projects that are powering the new web, new applications on the web, the cloud, but they're mostly being developed and maintained by large companies. So Google with Kubernetes, React with Facebook, right? So you have these large tech companies that are releasing open source versions of their own software, which helps develop a development flywheel there. But this is, again, it really powers so much of the major internet that we have today is based on this infrastructure that is all open source then. But again, here they're mostly controlled and developed and maintained by these large centralized companies. I think we're in the 4th era now, blockchain and AI. These kind of come, I think, at 2 different areas. I think with AI, this is, I think, the first time when people see open source AI as like a legitimate part of the innovative trend, the era right now. So like obviously Llama with Facebook, they have a really competitive model there, and people can see how this wide distribution of a bunch of people contributing to the projects can actually lead to a better innovative cycle there. And yeah, obviously Ethereum is open source, and like crypto is open source in a lot of ways, the core blockchains. I think that's really important for establishing a culture of open source. This is what I think is really great about Ethereum, is that there is this kind of culture of open source. But increasingly we need to see that move away from just like the base layer and move up the stack, I think, to the app layer. So those are kind of the 4 eras, and I think we're at an inflection point right now. I think people speak positively about open source software and all the contributions, but people are very worried about its sustainability. If you look at the success of open source software right now, as the ones I mentioned in that 3rd one, almost all of them are being spearheaded by a gigantic centralized tech company, and so that's not necessarily the long-term sustainability that you might be looking for. And what we're trying to think about is, well, how can we have like smaller bottoms-up open source projects there? Just to take a step back and think, like, why do we want open source to succeed? Like, we are all of these like rah-rah people, open source is great, and we want to stick it to the man. But I think it's important that we kind of reflect it there. The reason that we're doing this is not because it is, as I said, something that good, we're protecting the environment. The reason is because it creates a better, more innovative system with less extractive business models. So I think this is the open source flywheel. So this is just what needs to happen in a bunch of different industries to get things moving into development. So you start somewhere on this, open source software becomes popular because it's free. This attracts more users. That improves the software, which allows it to outcompete centralized software. And then it can attract more developers and users because it has low cost of development here. The key part, the problem with this is getting this flywheel started. So if we look in the web development in the cloud era with React and Kubernetes, this has been kickstarted by the centralized tech companies, and it runs pretty well, but we need to figure out a way of kickstarting this without that. Zero lock-in is a, hey, how are you guys doing? Zero lock-in is a phrase that I really think we should embrace a little bit more. I think that really also strikes to the consumer side of things. So much of open source development has been geared towards technical developers and building systems and core infrastructure for them. But I think zero lock-in is something that's really powerful to consumer because that really just gives a company ability to extract rent in a way. It also creates stronger products, right? If people have to compete over the users themselves, right? Not just relying on that moat, that's going to create more companies. It's going to lower the barriers to entry and allow more competition in there. Yeah, and this is kind of what I was saying at the end. I think it's important that we kind of shift. I want to shift some of the language that we're using to describe open source, right? And talking about it being like pro-consumer, pro-market, right? Things that are typically like thrown in more in this like big business element. But I think in a lot of ways, open source is the most pro-market way of operating. So what do we need? How do we get to this future? What do we need for open source to succeed? We need new incentive structures to make open source development more sustainable. There's a bunch of different ones that we're going to talk about this week that we're going to be presenting. People from the DRIPS folks with Radical. There's some another one from Gitcoin. So different models for these new incentive structures. And I think Ethereum really is pioneering this area. So how do we do this? We need to create upside for investors into open source software now. People that fund open source software do so most either out of the goodness of their hearts or because they're a centralized company that benefits from its development. So we have to figure out a way to introduce capital. This is why we've got the open source capitalist. We have to figure out a way to introduce capital into the open source development model. We need to make it easy to pay open source contributors. I just talked to someone an hour ago that stopped by that said he's building a way to pay contributors on GitHub through GitHub commits. Things like that are really important so that you can have these like small level of contributions from large numbers of people that in aggregate form a lot, but figuring out how to incentivize that behavior can be challenging. Return value to core development. There was a lot of money that is made off of open source infrastructure, open source products, and we need to figure out a way to redevelop some of that revenue and resources into core development themselves. I don't know if people have been following like the WordPress drama, but this is kind of a very classic example of misaligned incentives where you have a company that is trying to build a consumer product, or not really a consumer product, but a product and service off of open source software, and then the open source software, the foundation that owns the license for the open source software doesn't think that they're doing enough to like pay back for the use of that open source software. So I think there need to be clear guidelines on how you like actually recycle that revenue there and return value to core development there. So lastly, I just wanted to think a little bit like what would this world look like if we had more open source software everywhere? What would this kind of, imagining that a little bit more. One thing I found interesting is like, I think increasing importance of brands, right? If you can't rely on like the software itself, like what that ultimate brand that does that selling to the user, to the product, even if it's like free, even if they're, it's an advertising-based product, or if it's something like that, ultimate brand becomes really, really valuable because that's really the only thing that a user is opting you for because you don't have the code to rely on. Obviously, it would drastically lower the cost of software development if everyone was using open source software, because we wouldn't have to redevelop so many different things. I think smaller companies is another idea, right? That we can actually build. We could build complex products, build complex systems, but not need these gargantuan companies to do it. And then if we do have more open source software at like the platform level, then that also means it lowers the cost of entry to different projects. So you could have tons of different consumer products competing, trying to offer the best one, and that means that you, as a single developer or a small team, can actually compete with that, because you don't have to have this huge obstacle to enter the market there. So I don't know if there's anything else that people were thinking about on how would OSS penetration change things, or that, or maybe why people are excited about open source development there. But that's what I had for here.